Today I'm going to talk about a rare book, Unloved. Now, by Unloved, I mean that I recently offered this book at the Boston ABA Antiquarian Virtual Book Fair, and it was not purchased. So therefore, it is unloved. I'm going to discuss why I think this book is absolutely wonderful, and I'm going to theorize a little bit on why I think it did not sell. Normally, I delve right into the title and the author of the work, the most important aspects of a book, but this time I'm going to talk about first some of the finer points and then work into the title. The reason I wanted to do that is because when you're flipping through so many listings on a book fair or through a catalog, it's easy just to gloss past a list of titles and authors and say you don't want this, you don't want that, you've seen that, without noticing some of the details. And really it's the details where you are going to find interesting avenues of research as well as exciting finds. Let's start by talking about the printer. It says here, imprinted at London by Richard Field, dwelling in Blackfriars by Ludgate in 1599. So this is an Elizabethan work. Now, if you are a lover of Shakespeare, one of the most interesting aspects of Shakespearean bibliography studies are the source books of Shakespeare, the books that he used and consulted in the writing of his plays. And when you delve into that particular aspect, you quickly find there are a remarkable number of copies of Shakespearean source books printed by Richard Field. Now, Field was a Stratford contemporary of Shakespeare. They probably knew each other as school children and probably kept in touch later in life in London. Field actually went on to print the first two of Shakespeare's published works, I think 1593, Venus and Adonis, which is, I think only survives in one known copy in the first edition, and The Rape of Lucrece. He was also involved in the printing of two of the most famous Shakespearean source books, Holinshed's Chronicle. He was probably working as an apprentice during the printing of that work, as well as he printed North's translation of the Lives of Plutarch. This is more of a minor Shakespearean source book. It probably had some influence on the writing of Henry V. But I do love the connection between Richard Field and Shakespeare, and I imagine Shakespeare going to Field's printing establishment and seeing the books and consulting and touching them and being inspired to write by the works that he found there. And certainly there is evidence of that in his plays. And of course, since everybody knows Shakespeare, it's that type of thing that really makes this the type of, a coffee table conversation starter. Of course, if you go that route, just be careful with the coffee. Let's talk a little bit about the provenance of the work, the ownership of the work. This has a very nice 17th century inscription at the top, with a Latin motto. First it says Parisum si non parisum, basically translates to I would have perished had I not persisted. So a sort of early try again type of motto. And actually Instagram that, I love that motto so much. So if you're not following me on Instagram, go follow me on Instagram. It has the signature then of Thomas Anderton. Thomas Anderton was a Benedictine prior at the monastery in St. Edmund's in Paris in the 17th century. So a Catholic institution, which is very interesting because if you go back to the Tudor times and Henry VIII and you think about the dissolution, the famous dissolution of the monasteries in England during that period, that was really the end of Benedictine monasticism in England. And then under Queen Elizabeth, Catholicism really went underground. If you were a practicing Catholic, you really had to do it at a religious institution as a persecuted minority. On the continent, in a country that was favorable to Catholics, such as France, where they did establish the Benedictine monastery of St. Edmund's there. So a very interesting aspect of history there, religious persecution, and Englishmen living in France long before it was fun and popular to be an expatriate living in Paris like Hemingway. So let's talk now about the binding. Now this is how you want to find a book of the period, a beautiful near contemporary calf binding with some with a gorgeous gilt lozenge there. And it's relatively clean throughout with wide margins. There are a couple of flaws in the book, but even those flaws are quite interesting. For instance, on page 508 here, there is a slice right through the inner margin. Normally that is a serious defect, but in this particular case, that's actually interesting because it's either a paper flaw or it was jammed during the printing process, because you can see the letters sort of twisted on the page there. And that gives some insight into printing establishments during the Elizabethan period and how they went about making the books themselves. Finally, let's talk about the title of the work, The History of Guicciardin. Francesco Guicciardin was a friend of Machiavelli, and he was in his own right one of the most important political theorists of the Italian Renaissance. And this is actually the history of the Italian Wars, one of the most important works of historiography during the early modern period. And if you're interested in the Renaissance, it is an extraordinarily important source book because it is on the politics of the Italian peninsula from about 1490 to 1530 or so, and the arts and culture, of course, intersected with the politics then, often in very dramatic fashion. So the work was actually translated from the Italian into English by Geoffrey Fenton. Many works were translated from Italian into English during the Elizabethan period, and that is a very interesting aspect of scholarship. Geoffrey Fenton was actually an ardent anti-Catholic, so I find it curious that a Catholic owned the translation of an anti-Catholic. They're going to explode when they hit each other. This is actually the second edition in English. I think the first was 1579 or so, but this is the edition that I love because it was printed, as I said, by Richard Field, who certainly knew Shakespeare. So why was this fabulous book not sold immediately at the fair? Well, part of it is when you're glossing over so many of these listings, you can't really engage dealers and you can't engage the books themselves. And that's really the fun and joy of the book business and why you should get well acquainted with dealers, because then you can truly fall in love once you learn how interesting a work is. With that said, people have a tendency today to over-rely on some of the auction databases. I've talked about Rare Book Hub before, which is an excellent database. But they are just data points. And if you quickly look through auction records for this book, you will find other copies for $1,000 or so. But they might be lesser copies, and you have to open up and really study the bindings and any flaws associated with them. And this is certainly one of the nicest copies that I have seen in many years of the work. You might also consult a database like ESTC, the English Short Title Catalog online. And when you do that, you find that this work is quite well represented institutionally. Libraries have copies of the works. And dealers today really want works that are extraordinarily rare, that are only found in a few libraries worldwide. and those do indeed sell very quickly. So you have a work here without a very strong auction record and with libraries holding the work already. So you can understand on a very cursory basis why it wasn't immediately snapped up. With that said, when you really study the work and this particular copy, it's extremely interesting. Now, the other thing is I could have overpriced it, and I indeed put it up at $3,750. In my mind, that's a very reasonable price for this particular copy of the work. Now, I know that they encourage collectors not to think about rare books as investments. Meanwhile, at the back of their mind, they're thinking about investments. I can tell you, though, that Elizabethan works in good condition are actually an excellent investment because there are fewer and fewer of them every year, and I have a harder and harder time finding them. So, that is my rare book, Unloved, and I hope you will tune in for other episodes so I can discuss some other books that I love. So thank you so much for watching.